to the On the Horizon podcast, Buying and Selling Businesses, brought to you by Horizon Business Brokers, your trusted guide to buying, selling, and valuing businesses. Your next opportunity is just on the horizon.
So what's your business actually worth? Like most business owners, they have a number in their head, but the real number depends on a lot more than just a gut feeling. So in this episode, we're exploring the fundamentals of business valuation, how it's calculated, what drives it, and the common mistakes that can cost sellers big. Welcome to On the Horizon. Jeremy Wolf here with Dustin Zeher. Dustin, good to see you, brother.
Good to see you, Jeremy.
Yes. Okay, so obviously there are a host of factors that go into the valuation of a business. But from your perspective, what are some of the key drivers that influence how a business is valued?
The key drivers in business valuation is truthfully primarily cash flow performance. Buyers are buying cash flow, lenders are lending against cash flow. But it's not the only thing that drives a business's value. Maybe a business isn't cash flow positive, but maybe the business has a large amount of inventory, so that would have value. Maybe the business has a large amount of heavy machinery and equipment and assets, so that has value. When you look at everything together, it has perhaps more inherent value, or maybe in some situations a business needs to be broken apart and liquidated to get the most value, because maybe the cash flow doesn't support the total value that might be greater than what the equipment would be worth on its own, per se, not to overcomplicate things. So at the end of the day, it's what a business owns and earns, and the risk that's associated to buying that business is ultimately going to determine what the value of that business is in the marketplace, where you have that willing buyer and that willing seller that are going to negotiate those fair and marketable terms that really determine that true market value.
What about growth potential? How do you, when you get inside a business and you look to analyze where the business is at and where it could potentially go, how do you kind of assess the potential for growth with that business?
So in most small business transactions, while growth potential gets factored into maybe a buyer's decision, it's not so much factored into the valuation, because the potential really turns out to be more of projections. Now, maybe there is some past performance and maybe you're growing at 10, 15, 20% a year, and maybe you could reasonably project that continued growth. Does a buyer pay for that growth potential, immediately upon sale? Likely not. That value may be earned, over time as the business performs, maybe through, an earn-out type of structure, or maybe there is some seller financing, if key milestones are met, that additional payouts are made, kind of similar to an earn-out structure. So buyers and lenders are really making their decisions based off of past performance, because that's a good indication of what the future performance will be to be able to service, the business's debt from the acquisition, and then obviously have money left over to wage to cover living expenses of that buyer, and hopefully have enough money left over to invest in the business.
Can you walk us through the main valuation methods like SDE and EBITDA multiples?
Yeah. So it really is a tongue twister. So it got you and many others. So your EBITDA multiples or EBITDA calculation, those multiples are more geared for kind of corporate strategic mergers and acquisitions. So this is typically like if a company is buying another company, they're looking at the EBITDA, right? And the EBITDA acronym is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It does not generally take into consideration the compensation, because that owner is performing a job, right? That if an individual buyer might be buying that business, that individual buyer's probably going to assume the position of that exiting seller, right? But in these corporate strategic mergers and acquisitions, usually, there's already an owner operator of that company, right? They're not going to also be the owner operator of the company that they're acquiring. So maybe that seller is staying on. Maybe they're going to maintain a salary. Maybe that position needs to be fulfilled by another, a new hire, or maybe it can be absorbed into some of the other positions that the acquiring entity might already have, right? So there are some variables that could change what the EBITDA calculation be for some corporate strategic buyers. But the thought is it's a multiple of its EBITDA in corporate, corporate mergers and acquisitions, because the buyer is replacing the owner. Now, those multiples, your EBITDA multiples, are typically a little higher for most businesses. I've seen that they could be anywhere from about, I would say, 1.5 to 2 times your SDE multiples. Okay. So maybe your EBITDA multiples are, say somewhere between 3 and 5 times EBITDA, where your cash flow multiple might only be somewhere between, say, 2 and 3 or 3.5 times. Okay. So we've broken down EBITDA. Your SDE is seller's discretion, which is really
I think you cut out there for a second. Seller's discretionary.
Yep. So SDE stands for seller's discretionary earnings. Okay. Or another word, synonymously used would be cash flow of the business. And this is really an adjusted EBITDA formula. So it is the earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, but it also takes into consideration the compensation, right? Because again, this is more for that individual independent buyer that's buying this business, that's going to be stepping in the shoes and performing the same roles and responsibilities of that exiting business owner / seller, right? So they're going to get all of that cash flow for themselves. And again, depending on the industry, multiples are going to vary. But in most kind of mainstream, you're typically looking at a SDE multiple of about 2 to 3 times cash flow versus those EBITDA multiples that might be 3 to 5 times cash flow. At the end of the day, really, these numbers should be very close to one another. For example, if you're taking out, $100,000 salary of the owner operator, and that's going to be a expense to the acquiring corporation. They're paying you a 3 to 5x multiple that should be somewhat equivalent to what that 2 to 3x multiple would be if they didn't have this $100,000 cost. I should have been better prepared to provide some quick math to really give a real life example.
Math is hard.
Maybe we can and share that later, but
sure. So Dustin, what is recasting, and why is that an important part of small business evaluation?
Yep.
Or valuation.
So recasting is a huge element in trying to determine what the true EBITDA is, or what the true SDE is, right? Because as you may have heard us talk about in some earlier segments, business owners tend to take with their small businesses or large businesses, where they may have the company pay for personal health or life insurance, maybe 401k or IRA contributions. Not so much liberties there, but more so actual benefits that need to be documented and accounted for and recasted into the SDE or EBITDA kind of calculations to determine what the true benefit is to a new owner operator. Excessive liberties could be things like cell phones, personal vehicle expenses, whether it's gas or maintenance or car insurance. Maybe it's personal meals, travel, entertainment. These are a lot of things that we see that get run through a business, sometimes categorized correctly, sometimes not. And we'll try to give our best advice there. But these are things that to understand and recast back into the cash flow, which also leads me to talk about recasting other things like maybe the business owns the real estate that that the business operates from, and maybe the business pays fair market rent and there's no that needs to be done at all, because if maybe the seller is going to lease back the building, and they're going to lease back the building at the exact same rate that they've been charging themselves. But if they're going to be leasing back the building at a higher rate or a lower rate, that's going to change the cash flow to the buyer, and that could ultimately impact the value up or down, right? Same thing if they were going to be buying the real estate, then you're going to have a mortgage. So what does mortgage payment look like compared to what that rent payment has been, right? Other things that are commonly recasted that you need to understand, and I think we've talked about before, is if there's maybe a husband and a wife team that are operating the business together and they're each taking a salary, are their salaries commensurate to market? Or are they taking an inflated salary, or maybe they're not paying themselves what their replacement cost would be? Because if you're selling the business, to an independent buyer, they're not going to be able to replace, a husband and a wife team, or two brothers, or two partners, or multiple partners that might be working, full-time hours. So these things need to be accounted for and properly recasted to determine what the true cash flow would be for a single owner operator and what that value would be in the open marketplace potentially.
So going back to the real estate, I'm curious, from your experience, do you feel like, I'd imagine it's a case-by-case basis, but have you seen when the real estate is included in the sale as opposed to kept separate? Are there any pros or cons with either of those ways of doing things?
Yeah. So, most of the transactions that we have been a part of, and this could just be because of our marketplace being in the DC metro area, primarily real estate's just extremely expensive. Most of our situations are dealing with lease assignments or new leases to be made. We've certainly have had our fair share of real estate transactions being involved in part of a business transaction. They are usually separate transactions because typically, and how it should be done on to protect yourself on a liability basis is, there should be an entity that owns the real estate and there should be an entity that owns the business, and they are really two separate assets, and they really are valued differently if they're being sold separately or together. So I would best advise that if you do own your real estate, you need to talk to an experienced business broker and M&A advisor, as well as potentially a commercial realtor, to make sure that you're best positioning yourself for the most economical sale for your two assets. I will say also that having real estate as part of a sale can be a huge pro, or it could also be a huge con, in the sense that depending on the value of that real estate, that could significantly increase the overall value and purchase price to the buyer for business and real estate. So you might shrink kind of your buyer pool. Like, if you have a business that's worth $1 million and real estate that's worth $1 million, well, if you're just selling the business, a buyer only needs to come to the table with $100,000, so to speak, for their 10% down payment, right? But if they're also trying to buy this real estate, and that's going to come along with typically maybe another 10% or even 20 or 25% down payment. That could be another $100,000 to $200,000 that a buyer may need to bring. So it's kind of potentially two different calibers of financially positioned buyers. Somebody that has $100,000 compared to a couple $100,000. Banks, of course, will always like to see real estate as part of a transaction because it gives them a real tangible asset,
something they can go after, as collateral. Yeah. Sure. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see owners make when trying to value their own business? Because everybody, like I alluded to at the top of the episode, if you're in it and it's your business, you tend to inflate the value because it's yours, right? There's a lot of bias there. So like, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see when owners try to come up with a value for their business?
Yeah, well, the mistake is just miseducation and misinformation that they're getting from maybe advisors that might know accounting or finance very well, or maybe M&A law very well, but not necessarily business value very well. So over my 20 years and helping people buy and sell businesses, and talking to these business owners that say, hey, they ask us to value their business, and we give them the news, hey, your business is worth $1 million. And they're like, oh my, $1 million? Like I thought it was going to be worth 5 million or 10 million because, I was told that, I can get, 3 times my gross annual revenues. I'm like, well, there is something that's called 3 times your earnings, your cash flow earnings. Like that might be a common practice for, maybe your industry or maybe not your industry. And I would help them understand, just give them some general rules of thumb. Because there are different kind of valuation, multiples, for, certain, for various industries. And if you're in a certain industry, depending on the size of your business, under $1 million in revenue is going to sell for a different multiple than if you're doing 1 to 5 million or 5 to 10 million or more. Right. So it's more about, again, the misunderstanding and not being properly educated, is making the mistake. But the mistakes that are made, if they're trying to get that proper education, is, are they pulling the right numbers, right? Like did they calculate EBITDA correctly? Did they, when they're calculating their seller's discretionary earnings, and some may think, well, I spent $10,000 in marketing and advertising this year. Like that was discretionary. I didn't need to do that. Like, but no, that is a legitimate business expense that, a business should be doing. And, you probably attribute a certain amount of your revenues to the marketing and advertising that you've done. So you can't have that back. You can't take that as an add back, so to speak. So those are pretty common mistakes, just adding back things that shouldn't be added back, and just not knowing proper multiples just because they're not getting the right information.
Yeah. It all goes back to, like we talked about on the previous episode, being organized, right. And putting systems in place and not letting things get out of hand and just staying on top of everything. That's the key. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dustin, let's leave it at that. Everyone, if you enjoyed this content, if you found it useful, please let us know. Leave some comments, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. We appreciate you joining us on this journey, and we look forward to catching you all next time on the next episode of On the Horizon. Everyone, take care. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thanks. See you next time.
That wraps up this episode of On the Horizon podcast, Buying and Selling Businesses, brought to you by Horizon Business Brokers. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone ready to take their next step. For more resources and personalized support, visit www.horizonbrokers.com or call 703-910-7384. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time on The Horizon, where buying and selling businesses creates opportunity.